Uh, I want to welcome everyone. I'm Abraham Leapson, and together with Jerry, we co-chair the adult education programs at Kehilat Hanahar. And I mention that because I see we have some visitors, and welcome, and be interested to know how it is that you learned about these programs. Um, Today we have a very interesting guest, and our topic is MidEast peace. And I'm writing on here, a pipe dream or missing diplomatic creativity. Uh, if you want to get yourself all upset, take a look at the morning newspaper. I mean, this morning we see about Putin and Ukraine and other places, and just places are every place seems to be like on the brink of major conflagrations, and it's just tough to take. But so here we have Christopher Mott. Let me tell you a little bit about his background. He's a research fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. He's an international relations scholar focused on historical geopolitics, grand strategy, and the intersection of defensive realism and conceptions of sovereignty in an area of increasing multipolarity, and is also a former researcher at the desk officer of the U.S. Department of State. He holds a PhD in international relations from the University of St. Andrews and MA in international relations from London Metropolitan University, and a BA in history from Rutgers University, and is the author of the book, The Formless Empire, A Short History of Diplomacy and Warfare in Central Asia. Now, how did I meet this young man? We had the misfortune of being very much affected by Hurricane Ida. We had like 72 inches or 60 inches of stinky mud in our basement. But being blessed to be in Lambertville, we've got a whole system of volunteers. And here I see this bucket brigade of people schlepping heavy, stinky, muddy buckets out of my basement. And one of the people on the line is this young man. And I, during the couple of days of doing this, I said, "What's your day job?" So obviously it wasn't hauling buckets of mud. So that led to a conversation. And eventually, I invited him to be a speaker here, and he accepted. I was thrilled. But I gave him the challenge of focusing, not on other parts of the world, but the parts of the world that is near and dear to so many of us. And this almost impossible idea of, could there be peace in the MidEast? Now, I don't know whether we're going to get a magic formula here or not, but with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Christopher Mott.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction. Very formal introduction, but I appreciate it. I would like to say that this is the topic that was chosen because it would be most likely to appeal to the audience here. But I do want to add the disclaimer that I'm not a Middle East specialist. It's not my primary region. But it is something, of course, I pay a lot of attention to because it intersects with so many things. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a kind of prepared statement so we have something to base off of. And then once that statement is completed, I'd like it to be more conversational. People could, ask questions themselves, and I'll respond to them on a one-to-one basis as they go through. But just to kind of set my take on the challenge, which Abraham sprung on me which is a challenge, and I have no magical answers to it, but I'm going to give you kind of my prepared response, and then I'll stay once I'm done reading that, and then we can have a more informal kind of chat-based thing with the Q&As. So, okay, so peace in the Middle East, a realistic if unlikely possibility. The recent Abraham Accords have opened up a new avenue for Arab countries to start normalizing relations with the State of Israel, as has been shown by the quid pro quo of Israel and the United States recognizing Moroccan control over Western Sahara. This has been accomplished by avoiding ideological issues and simply focusing on the reality of mutual interest and diplomatic exchange between states. There's a very real possibility that this regional trend will accelerate due to Saudi Arabia and Israel becoming more and more concerned with their mutual foe, Iran. Both countries also serve as alternate vectors for regional power and influence from that of Turkey, whose aggressive neo-Ottoman turn in the past decade puts many in the region on edge. There are now at least three distinct power blocks that are growing in strength as the US diminishes its direct role compared to what it once was in the region. Saudi Arabia and Egypt, that's one block, not two different ones. Saudi Arabia, Egypt working together. Turkey and is the other one, and Iran is third of these major power blocks. What these blocks and their allies do will most likely determine if the region is going to have more or less conflict as it moves into a future devoid of a single dominant power. In IR terms, we call this multipolarity. So it's a word I might use later. It just means that there's multiple power poles and there's no clearly dominant faction. So that's multipolarity. Currently, the major nexus of conflict in the region is the Syrian civil war. This is a conflict that contains all of the most notorious problems of the Middle East: sectarianism, state failure, bungled foreign interventions, and a refugee crisis emanating from all of the above. Almost all significant regional powers are or have been involved in some way in this war, and there have been more than two sides of the conflict for some time. What started as an internal domestic dispute rapidly evolved into a free-for-all for those seeking a proxy war with Iran and to overthrow the government in Damascus versus Tehran and Moscow defending their pre-existing alliances with the Syrian state. The internal aspect of the war is now less important than the international one, with what remains of the opposition dominated by foreign jihadist fighters and protected by Turkish intervention in the north of the country. Presently, it is Turkish power and pride that prolongs a war that should have and could have ended at least 5 years ago. Israel also plays a role, if a far less substantial one, at first supporting rebels and now more confined to launching airstrikes on Iranian-backed forces in the country. It is apparent that for those of us who want to see less conflict in the region and a path forward to a more constructive future, that these countries being in the Middle East, uphold the idea of state sovereignty when dealing with each other as a first and foremost principle, i.e., they should deal with each other through diplomacy first as peers rather than interfere in each other's domestic affairs. While certain countries like Israel and Syria may never have normal relations, even such arch rivals as Iran and Saudi Arabia one day could, with both agreeing to respect Iraqi sovereignty, as an example, in order to not stumble into another proxy war with each other. What do I mean by sovereignty specifically? The most minimalist and universal definition I can come up with is one that would be accepted by most people, is that sovereignty is the ultimate authority held over a fixed territorial region. In the modern era, this is almost always states, with most successful states at least partially resembling something similar to the models laid out by Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza in the 17th century. Though it is worth noting that pre-modern conceptions of sovereignty, such as imperial Chinese bureaucratic state, Chinese legalist philosophy like that of Han Fei, and the cyclic state regime model of Ibn Khaldun also work with overlapping concepts. The Middle East in particular, however, needs a concept where the state's authority is primary in its territory but extends no further, forcing the different states to deal with each other as fully autonomous entities more interested in dealing in frank exchanges of interest rather than working to interfere inside each other's domestic realm. Historical parallels for emerging out of a period of sectarian fanaticism into a more pragmatic future do in fact exist. Most notably, there was the end of the 30 Years' War in 17th century Europe, where disputes over political rule and the role of religion in state affairs boiled into the most proportionally deadly conflict in European history per percentage of population killed. This conflict, where Catholic France already had put paid to faith-based solidarity by allying with the Protestants, ended with the Treaty of Westphalia, where the different princely states of the Holy Roman Empire agreed to leave matters of domestic and religious affairs as the prerogative of the state's domestic policy and agreed to conduct diplomacy as legal equals regardless of the differences in ideological governance. Westphalia would go on to lay the groundwork for the modern state system and helped enable the conditions for greater levels of secularism and eventually what is now known as the Enlightenment. The conditions in the Middle East are, of course, totally different than that example. But the success of the post-Westphalian European state on the world stage does imply that sovereignty is a major key to international stability. One of the reasons Turkey is arguably the strongest power in the region today is because it avoided being carved up in the aftermath of World War I and dedicated itself to becoming a modern sovereign state, achieving a successful war against the Allies while also toppling the archaic Ottoman Empire and Caliphate. The early Turkish Republic was born into nearly post-apocalyptic circumstances, yet was able to assert its sovereignty and thus its comparative internal stability, becoming one of the more successful regional states. Sovereignty is indeed one of the core principles listed in the founding ideology of the state under the CHP, or Republican People's Party, something that enabled it to embark on a remarkable amount of modernization on issues like women's rights, public education, and the like. The opposite trend occurs in those societies with insecure or failing states, like in Afghanistan during and especially after the Soviet invasion, and later and more contemporary history, or Iran, where the old monarchy was an American client and whose currently besieged revolutionary government sees threats behind the actions of most other nations in the region. It is, of course, telling that with the rise of the Islamist AKP, or Justice and Development Party in Turkey, that this principle of sovereignty, at least in regards to other nations, has been fatally compromised in the Turkish example. All gains in politics are temporary reactions to specific circumstances, of course. Nevertheless, the example of sovereignty and its role in securing a more stable foundation for the future cannot be ignored. It is states with less security in their sovereign authority that tend to tip towards sectarianism, bloviating foreign policy, and demagoguery. Ideas can't be introduced, but must be actively cultivated in the long term. When even a formerly strong sovereignty is weakened, it can reopen society to the forces of sectarianism and reaction. But if multiple states dedicate themselves to their own perfection rather than striving for a remade region based off of their ideology, and do so in roughly the same time period, then major diplomatic breakthroughs become possible. If the Syrian civil war and its various factional actors can be sidelined or ended, I believe a new kind of Westphalianism could rise in the Middle East, simply out of necessity, with the professed creeds of various states taking a backseat to the simple negotiation of interests between peers. This will not do away with conflict any more than it did in Europe, is in a total ideal of perfectly peaceful world, but it could make diplomacy much easier and thus reduce it, as well as reduce the conflict for influence between non-state radicals that are sometimes backed by state actors. And this brings me to the United States, because that's where we are right now. The US role in the Middle East for a long time, and especially since the launch of the War on Terror, has been one that undermines rather than affirms state sovereignty. From Iraq to Libya to Syria and many other countries indirectly shaken by the policies, its policies Washington has enacted and proxies it has funded, the inflammation of regional tensions has uniformly resulted. This is why the US playing a role more like that of negotiator and facilitation, like between the United Arab Emirates and Morocco, coming to deals with Israel for diplomatic normalization, rather than that of directly intervening to upset the naturally occurring regional balance of power, is a more viable future path for US policy, and one that could be quite constructive. Those concerns with the direction of the region should be pushing for a bargain between sovereign states rather than a constant meddling that in fact undermines their sovereignty and thus increases the chance of conflict and distrust in diplomacy, particularly with outside powers. Diplomacy only thrives when states know they are negotiating from a position of relative stability and legitimacy in the eyes of their peers across the table. Therefore, I contend that if US foreign policy elites wish to increase rather than undermine stability in the region, big if here, I know, that they should support a Treaty of Westphalia-style diplomatic accord across the region, tied with restarting the Iran deal and using it as a springboard to grow diplomatic accommodation across the board. This would involve playing a background facilitating role rather than being the star of the show, which is another thing US foreign policy elites often struggle with, as they tend to believe in a national mythology that glorifies Washington's sense of exceptionalism and indispensability. Needless to say, this is not currently happening, even if we've seen some hints here and there, like with the Abraham Accords. We can't even get back on the Iran deal yet, although certain people are working on that right now, which it's worth reminding everyone that we broke the Iran deal, not Iran. So that's an element to it too. We are also adding conditions to getting back on the deal that did not exist under the previously accepted deal under the Obama administration. So this further complicates the process, but hopefully it will be at least somewhat successful. But I maintain that this process of getting back on the Iran deal and expanding that level of negotiation to other regional powers either could and should continue, and is in fact the key to helping this region become more stable and therefore more likely to be peaceful. This does require, however, the US to drop sanctioning everyone it doesn't like as a leverage, which is something it does. And I actually have a co-authored report up on the IPD website specifically about this phenomenon, how the United States has become addicted to economic sanctions of people it doesn't like, beginning in the Obama administration, doubling under Trump, and continuing to expand under Biden, and that economic sanctions often have extremely deleterious effects on the living standards and even livability of many countries, but usually the overwhelming percentage of the time do not produce actual results that the policy intends that are favorable to US policy. So we have an entire report on the IPD website basically calling out sanctions as a largely a failed enterprise in the current era, but that's leaving that aside for now. An important thing would be that Washington needs to stop deploying troops to both Syria and Iraq, because it puts them directly in the middle of these sectarian things, in which case Washington has often picked sides in these wars, and this undermines its ability to be a good faith behind the scenes facilitator to diplomatic solutions. So that would have to end. The Iran deal has to be gotten back on without making it more complicated than it already is. And of course, continuing the process of getting Arab states to recognize Israel formally. And I would add on top of all this, and very importantly, to stop identifying Washington's interests so strongly with the policy objectives of Saudi Arabia. That concludes what I have prepared to say. So I am perfectly happy to open it up to questions, and we could have a back and forth and deal with things as they come naturally.
Okay, feel free. I have a number of things that have come to mind. I take a worried position when we're dealing with theocracies.
Yeah.
The idea of political sovereignty probably is not in the cards. I also am very much concerned about the kind of concerns that, let's say, Americans have versus what Israelis have about what constitutes a personal existential threat in having atomic weapons available.
Yeah, well, I would say that sovereignty came about in the 17th century as a reaction to people having overly religious governments, which is why I picked it as a kind of helpful template. The fact is, Iran and Saudi Arabia both are theocratic governments, and other Gulf states are quasi-theocratic governments. It kind of depends, but I would say effectively, like Qatar and the UAE are sort of theocratic. Saudi Arabia and Iran definitely so. And this can be really, really hard to deal with because you're not negotiating on a quid pro quo basis. You're dealing with something that is kind of apocalyptic, and whose primary concern isn't necessarily the survival of the state so much as it is the survival of an ideology. The thing is, under pressure, all states eventually kind of, if they survive, if they maintain a government in power, they do become sovereignist, because they themselves must first survive before there are any ideologies they have survived. So I think Iran is under a ton of pressure. They do not have many allies. Their allies effectively are sort of the Houthis in Yemen, the government of Syria, and sometimes in the background Russia bulks them up, but that's a very fraught relationship. I think Iran wants to be on the Iran deal. Um, it was in fact the United States that broke it. So I think that their reticence right now is more just, well, what happens if a US election in the future goes a certain way and someone else comes in and tears up the deal again? What is the point of that? So they're going to have to negotiate as realists, whether they like to or not. Their position isn't strong enough to be exporting, Shia religion across. I mean, in the Middle East, they're already a minority. So I think that they are going to be forced to deal as a regular state, whether they like it or not.
You did say that economic pressure doesn't work, but in this case, doesn't economic pressure work with Iran?
It did under the first negotiations. Under the Obama administration, it did in fact have some role in getting the Iran deal started. I don't know how much of a role really, because people are always, American policymakers are always going to claim that it was American economic pressure that did it, rather than look at other regional factors. So what percentage of it is, was that brought about by US embargo? I don't really know. It did play, but the thing is, we're sanctioning them even more now. And now it's harder to negotiate because we've kind of overused sanctioning too much. Now people understand they're going to be sanctioned. They harden their domestic economy in preparation to be sanctioned. They know when the US doesn't like someone for whatever reason, it will sanction individuals, institutions, or entire states. This is an overused playbook, so the results diminish. Every time the US increases sanctions, I think it's less effective. So Iran would love to be free of most American sanctions, don't get me wrong, and that's a major region to be negotiating, but I don't think getting them to negotiate a weaker position than they had before is going to be very effective with that. I think doing it by not making these negotiations US-Iran directly, but rather a bunch of different people in the region, Egypt, Turkey, whatever, negotiating with Iran would probably be more effective. And it would also explode the myth that there's this unified bloc of Sunni versus Shia, which once again has been shown not to be true anymore. I think we've seen some, we saw when the Iraqi state collapsed over a decade ago, and under the conditions of the Syrian civil war, we have 100% seen a sectarian start to a lot of these things. But as things have evolved, we have seen the divisions within the Sunni world as well. Turkey and Qatar versus Saudi Arabia and Egypt, the collapse of relations between these various powers. And at this point, it's just very obvious the non-state actors are the most theocratic, and the state actors are moving more and more towards a position where they could reach, theoretically, I'm not promising anything, but theoretically a grand bargain, which the US could play a role in. It would probably be best if Israel did not play a role in it at this time, but eventually, if we keep getting Arab states to recognize Israel, it will become inevitable. And a more stable Middle East will no longer have the card of who is Israel's #1 foe to play for pride, and they're going to have to negotiate with it too. I mean, it's not going anywhere. So you have that aspect to deal with as well. And everyone knows, even though it's not official, that Israel is a nuclear power de facto. And so its sovereignty is basically guaranteed. So most people, I would say, that yell about Israel in the Arab world are largely just sore losers at this point, and they're doing it for social cred, and it's less indicative of actual policies they want to carry out. In Iran's case, this is slightly different, of course, because Iran has a very close relationship with Hezbollah. But of course, Hezbollah has been completely sucked into the Syrian civil war now. The vast majority of what it does is fight in Syria, not in Lebanon. So that too might be less of a problem than it used to be, but that's a temporary arrangement because the Syrian civil war has basically been 90% over for a couple of years now, and it's really just Turkey prolonging it. So, will Hezbollah be redeployed towards Lebanon in the near future? That is very possible. But right now, that is not the case. Most of their forces are in Syria.
So I'd ask the people here, what other questions do you have? I mean, I know there's a yearning. I mean, certainly I feel that. I know that. Okay, Miriam, you unmute yourself.
Um, the role of tribal culture in the Middle East seems to be overlooked so much by the Western world. When the countries were divided up, when the area was divided up into countries after World War II, there seemed to be absolutely no understanding by those that were doing the divisions that these tribal cultures were really significant. There's much more than just Sunni and Shia over there, or there's subdivisions within them. I mean, how do you see this as affecting the peace process?
I think, well, it's the technical term for it is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That was the division of the old Ottoman Empire's Arab provinces between Britain and France. It has an important role because it determined borders in the region, and some of those borders are nonsensical. It is true, but not all of the borders are nonsensical. It's worth keeping in mind that Iraq was an Ottoman province before it became a British League of Nations mandate, which is a then politically correct way of saying colony. And while Iraq and Syria are in some ways artificial states, they do kind of adhere to an old Ottoman system that existed for centuries. So sometimes I think it gets exaggerated how fake these states are, but I do think that, yeah, the borders aren't always very logical. There are other divisions too. The French liked to elevate the Alawites and the Druze people in Syria, which created a weird kind of hierarchy that didn't exist before, a minority heavy hierarchy, which is still reflected in Syria's government today, albeit with a very different organization. So these kinds of divisions, though, I would say, they are strong in the Middle East, but not as strong as some parts of the world, like in much of Africa, where tribe will be a first identifier. I think in the Cold War, you saw a lot of people integrating into the modern state system, but imperfectly and often with many problems. But it's worth keeping in mind that when the state system arose in Europe, and more kind of naturally and gradually arose in Eastern Asia, these things happened too. There were official bureaucratic states that had a territorially fixed region that they focused on, but within that region, there were people that spoke different languages, had different cultures, had different lifestyles. And this is a normal process, but we're kind of seeing it in the information age and in the post-industrial era happening on like fast forward. It happens really, really fast. It happens really suddenly and dramatically, but it's still something that, well, happens. It happens as part of the development of becoming a bureaucratized state. And so, yeah, these divisions exist. These divisions are really important in Syria and Iraq in particular. There's, of course, the Kurdish issue that so many countries have, but they are no more unsurmountable than the kind of internal divisions that the European state system had to deal with in the past. So it's going to be difficult, it's going to be hard, and it might never be over. And it might permanently be a part of domestic politics. But if states that survive and states that thrive certainly could reach a level where they could make this less of a part of their foreign policy and therefore be better at conducting diplomacy with other countries without always having to work with non-state actors. Because I think our biggest thing as people that live outside of the Middle East, I assume mostly here, is the instability spillover effects of people using non-state actors to achieve political objectives. And this is the thing I think could be greatly reduced if we can get more people working on a state-to-state framework, regardless of how difficult it might be to start out with. But that's a really great question. Thanks for that.
Anybody else? I find myself thinking about other parts of the world, and I understand that the commotion that's going on in Kyrgyzstan, if I recall the name correctly, is Kazakhstan,
Yeah.
has a lot to do with economic injustice, which is the same story all over the world, including here. So that, you know, that they're good, there's lots of resources, good, you know, good businesses, good relations with world players in the oil business, except that there's no trickle down.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's true everywhere. What do we do about that? I mean, that seems to be part and parcel for the unrest and the instability is the moral aspects of the injustices involved.
I'm glad you brought that up because, yeah, I mean, the challenge you gave me, obviously, I had to take a very specific approach to make it manageable in length and not just be a dissertation on like everything. So I did cut out the economic aspect of it. But that's always in my mind because philosophically and politically speaking, I'm very much a materialist. And so I always like to pay attention to economic factors. The thing is, what we've learned from the decolonization period after World War II is that countries that have a fair amount of sovereignty also extends to the economic field. And I would say in the post-colonial realm where you're no longer worried about Britain and France and Spain, controlling you directly, and you're more worried about international economic institutions doing things in your economy, I think sovereignty also applies here because it's important. I would say just globally speaking, it's important to see different economic models work, what fails, what succeeds, and to create a kind of like natural selection of, okay, this looks like a good idea, this looks like a bad idea. What we've seen a lot of, particularly since the end of the Cold War, is the United States kind of try to get everyone onto the same economic system. And of course, different regions and different countries, they have different ecologies, they have different demographics, they have different resource bases. They can't all fit under the same system. It's kind of ridiculous. And so being part of, whether it's a global free trade regime or whatever you want to call it, can actually be very damaging to a developing country's future. They do different things. Most countries have to have some level of state planning if they want to go from undeveloped to developed. I mean, despite what it's a very common ideology in the United States that like the free market solves all problems. But if you just look at modern history and the development of societies, it's just, there is no case study that shows that to be the case. I think the closest anyone can come to is citing Hong Kong, which of course was never a sovereign nation and exploited a very, very specific niche between, as a kind of pseudo-British colony on the Chinese mainland. So it's, and Hong Kong's current, economy is not necessarily like infinitely, as comparatively strong as it used to be compared to the rest of China. So it's, I would say that it's good for countries to have a certain amount of economic autonomy too, so they can adjust to their local circumstances. I do think a secure and sovereign country is less likely to use trade embargoes because they're not afraid of being toppled by foreign actors. So it kind of comes back to a very defensive tribalistic mechanism. But many of these countries, they can't exist without trade. They don't have huge resource bases, or they only have like one kind of resource base, which is like oil in some of their cases, which is a curse in its own. So they need to diversify what they have access to, which means they have to be secure in their relations with each other, and they have to have trade deals with each other and please people outside the world. And I think it's really, really, really important for their development that they do that, but on their own terms, on their own secure terms. Now, if you want specifically to talk about how societies can be more peaceful because they're more egalitarian, I think that's a slightly different issue. I would generally agree with that. I think that economic egalitarianism is generally for the positive. But I think that, once again, they're going to have to do it in different ways. These aren't all the same countries, that they don't have the same amount of urban versus rural. They don't have the same amount of education levels. And so how they handle levels of redistributionism, or whatever you want to call it, is going to differ from country to country. And that's something that you would have to talk to an actual Middle East expert as to how it would work in country A or country B. But I do think it is a 100% valid thing to say that absolutely these countries need to be less aristocratic. They need to be less, they need to be less kind of peasantry versus a, specific ruling elite, and they need to have more social mobility at the very least, absolutely. Which, is something that Tunisia, which is the only successful Arab state in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. The rest of the Arab Spring movements either failed or made things worse. But Tunisia, where it began, for economic reasons, the protests began, is actually the place where you've seen some level of positive domestic change. So I guess if you want to talk about it in a positive sense, the Arab Spring has to be renamed the Tunisian Spring, because what other country benefited from that? None of them. But Tunisia does show that it's possible to have a kind of, well, we're still out. We don't know where the experiment will lead, but it does seem like it's a little bit better off than it used to be, and they're paying attention to the economic factors. So.
I see that Bert Johnson is here. Bert, you had emailed a question. I don't recall what it was. Do you want to ask that question of our guest? Unmute yourself.
You're muted, Bert, but I did see your question, and I tried to kind of work it into my final concluding paragraph.
Okay.
Albeit if he wants specifics, he can ask. Just
Okay.
Either hit the unmute button or hold down space bar while you talk. That should work.
Yeah, I was going to say, you mentioned that you would deal with that later, so that's fine.
No, I kind of alluded to it at the end of what I wrote, but I didn't get into the details. So if you'd like to re-ask your specifics, I'll answer them now. That'd be great.
Well, I think what occurred during the Trump administration was extremely disruptive, because I thought we were moving in a very positive way with the treaty and, with trying to get people to the table. And I think he turned things upside down. And I don't
With
think
Iran, yes.
I don't think the players in the Middle East, I have a background in international relations in undergraduate and some graduate work, but I think that most of the players in the Middle East do not trust us, and I don't blame them. And as you said in the beginning, they're not going to renegotiate, the deal, because Trump is still a strong player and may come back as president again. I hope not, but I mean, I can't imagine a year going by where congressmen were at least 7 congressmen were in active planning to overthrow a legitimate election, hang the vice president, kill Nancy Pelosi, why they haven't been brought to justice, and why this man still has a platform. What is wrong with our country and the American people, and why are the news media and the platforms still giving him a voice? He's an insurrectionist. He's a criminal. He should be in jail. And I think this is really disrupted, moving forward in the Middle East. And until we have a stable government, because we don't. I mean, what is it? 35% or more people in the United States believe that the election was stolen, that he's still a legitimate president. And I have sisters that believe that. So I'm the oldest of 7 children. And I had to stop speaking to 3 of my siblings, which I used to speak to every other day, because of their sending me videos about Trump and how. But I mean, our country is so unstable right now and so divided. And as an American who's always been involved in politics all my life, campaigning for politicians, launching Patrick Murphy as a candidate when he came back from Iraq, but I cannot imagine. I'm so sick. I am sick and disgusted that these insurrectionists, the ex-president, these Congress people, are still in Congress.
Right.
They're traitors. They should have been they need to be prosecuted.
Terrorists.
They were trying to overthrow a legal election, and they're still at it. And this is disrupting anything that can happen in the Middle East.
Well, I think you're entirely right that our fickleness and strangeness, and the fact that someone could come into power and just tear up a pre-existing treaty, which is exactly what Trump did with the Iran deal, could happen, is going to sabotage our diplomacy 100%. That's one of the reasons why I think that we should take a backseat and play a facilitator role and let regional actors handle the front row of the diplomacy rather than us do it ourselves. That's a really important thing. It's also important to know that scrapping the Iran deal was not the only thing that makes us untrusted in the region, not remotely, nor is the Trump administration the only administration that makes us distrusted in the region. There is more continuity in US foreign policy than there is difference from administration to administration, particularly in the aftermath of the war on terror, which has just been particularly, when it comes to US Middle East policy, I would say an unmitigated disaster from 2001 through the present day. And so I think it is worth noting that, we also told Gaddafi when he decided to give us a propaganda victory and say, I'll give up my weapons of mass destruction for a return to normal relations. And we said yes, because it was literally the only way that Bush could justify his Iraq policy, which was clearly failing at the time. We then said, okay, cool, Libya, come in from the cold. And then what happened a few years later is we attacked Libya and toppled their government and turned it into a state where there's open air slave markets, warlord fighting, Al-Qaeda has bases there, which is actually pretty normal for par for the course for American intervention in the region. Wherever we go, we tend to empower Al-Qaeda, ironically enough, and empower these non-state actors. So this is a continual cascade of failure that is thoroughly bipartisan, albeit I think in this particular case, the scrapping of the Iran deal by Trump is probably the most heinous diplomatic example. And these things are fueled by, of course, many factors. If you want to bring it back to economics, you could definitely say it's fueled by a for-profit defense industry that likes conflict and likes to make money off of conflict. Of course, they're more willing to see Middle East peace these days than they were in the past, because the Middle East is no longer important. The Middle East was necessary for them, and arms sales and whatnot, because the rest of the world was actually fairly stable in the immediate post-Cold War era, save for the post-Soviet Union and Central Africa. But now, with the rise of China, they've got something far bigger and much more legitimate, I would say, to be concerned with. And so they're going to be, I think, more DC actors might be more willing to compromise on the Middle East, because it's clear that the future of American foreign policy is not in the Middle East. It is in East Asia. And so that's probably going to allow us to take a more intelligent long-term approach. However, Bert's point is completely correct. Why would anyone trust us? And that's why I say the US should not be front and center of diplomatic projects. It should be a facilitator, and it should have other people in the region do this work from the ground.
Chris, I totally agree with that. And I hope at least that this is all going on in the background. I hope our diplomats, and I think they probably are.
I hope so.
Working in the background. And I totally agree. We need to take, a more diplomatic backseat approach, not be, not always come in as the heroes.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we have a powerful Navy, and we're probably going to keep our naval base in Bahrain. And I think with those things, we can just make sure that no one power is ever strong enough to dominate the region, which, as far as I'm personally concerned, is the only core national security interest that the US should have in the Middle East, is preventing one power from dominating the entire region. It's something you can do with a Navy. It's something you can do with the right connections. It's something you can do by facilitating diplomacy. You do not have to invade people's countries to do it, and you don't have to sanction everyone either. In fact, sanctioning them really hurts. So I would like to see a continuous movement in this direction.
I totally agree, because the sanctions are hurting the common people.
Mhm.
They're not hurting the people in power, because
They never do.
No,
Yeah.
They have their money spread all over, and
Exactly.
accounts.
They have Swiss bank accounts.
So right, so it's hurting
proxies.
the everyday people and making them hate the US more for what's happening to their children and their families. The other thing that was an absolute atrocity, after 12 years of the Kurds fighting for us side by side, that we just turned them over to the Turkish militias, and just let them be slaughtered. Let the Russians and the Turks move in there. I mean, it was just unbelievable what happened to Kurdish allies after
Well,
12
if
years of fighting for
being
us.
consistent here, if I'm making the case that one should not be supporting non-state actors in unstable regions, I would make the case that the US should not have supported the Kurds in the first place, except it is a specifically defensive thing when they were under attack by ISIS. I think that getting in bed with these organizations in places vulnerable to state failure will inevitably create conditions where you have to leave because it's not your state and you're not permanently there. And then you sell your allies down the river. But you kind of also help put them in that position too, by tying them to you and therefore kind of discrediting whatever they do. So I don't think the US should have been involved at all in either Syria or Iraq. And I don't think there should have been a US Kurdish alliance outside of maybe dropping the guns when they were fighting ISIS. And I don't think that, there should be Turkish involvement in Syria either. Russia's a bit different because they were invited there by the sovereign government. They were invited to defend their ally, which is something that we would do if an ally invited us to defend them. So that's a bit different, but the whole situation, this war, which is the biggest problem right now in the region, I think, though it's winding down, is caused by, not caused initially, but is prolonged by foreign intervention of all the powers that are prolonging it, because the war probably would have been over in 2015, 2016, which means that without a particularly Turkish intervention. And I think that is what's really exacerbating the refugee crisis more than anything. Like, ending a war, if you want to deal with refugee problems, if you want to deal with it, you should want to end wars and you should not want states to fail. Granted, there comes a point where maybe sometimes you do want a state to fail, but those are exceptional circumstances. And I fail to see what the state failure of Syria, how that would benefit the United States. It honestly does not. I think it does the opposite, because it empowers Islamic extremists, as long as the war continues and rebels continue to exist. Because the rebels, I hate to tell you this, are not quite the moderate Jeffersonian Democrats that a lot of the American media built them up to be. They are predominantly people who have a very open door policy with organizations like Al-Qaeda. The group Al-Nusra, which is currently called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was formerly known as Al-Qaeda in Syria. These are people who are mostly made up of people who received anti-tank and anti-helicopter weapons that we kind of funneled through Turkish and Arab proxies at the start of the war. So this is not particularly good. No one involved in this conflict looks very good, and I honestly would just like to see the US out of the country entirely.
So hearing you speak gives me very much an appreciation of the professional subject of diplomacy. I mean, as a layman, I have to dig deep in New York Times or whatever, but ordinarily I'm not exposed to that kind of thinking. What I get are news bites. I get opinions instead of news. I get all kinds of cockamamie stories. I don't have a grasp of reality, and it's very frustrating. And to hear you speak, I mean, we need to better understand the world the way you're explaining it, and how can this happen? We have to become students of understanding this kind of subject of relating country to country.
I think it's just important to keep in mind that there is I wouldn't say it almost happens on autopilot, so it's hard to say it's like intentional anymore, but there is this kind of assumption in a lot of English speaking media that, we are just immoral actors and everyone else is just like gross. When in effect, everyone is a self-interested actor. And I think one of the key interests in diplomacy is understanding how similar diplomats are to each other, state interests can be to each other. And once you kind of do that, it cuts through a lot of the BS in a sense. And it's like, you want this and we want this, and we're going to agree to set aside, whatever domestic divergences we have on X, Y, and Z, which is one of the reasons that I take a very dim view of like people that try to insert a lot of kind of ideology into the practice of foreign policy, because to some degree, yeah, everyone has some ideology and whatnot as a background thing, but there's a level of wheeling and dealing, a transactional relationship that just happens at these levels. And there's no, say what you will about the UN, positive, negative, or neutral, it's not powerful enough to completely regulate and control the behaviors of states, which means that states are the most powerful independent actor on the international stage. So once you get this, it becomes a kind of, okay, well, how do states relate to each other and be civil at the same time? How do they reduce going to war, which inevitably will happen, but it's good to make it happen less often. How do you do that? And I think frank, honest, direct diplomacy that is much more interest-based and values-based is just being honest, and that honesty helps cut through a lot of the BS. And we have a certain way of talking about things in the US, the UK, and Canada, that is kind of like, oh, but what about our values? Oh, we can't talk to that country. They have a different political system than us. And it's like, well, it's a different country than you. It has a different history. It has different circumstances. And in the future, it might be a liberal democracy, and the United States might not be. Like, these things are all temporary. These things change constantly. So like, why on earth would one assume that, one country is permanently this way and another? The fact is, they're here right now in the present. They need to figure out their interests. They need to reduce conflicts between them. They should talk to each other like relative equals. And this is where my point of sovereignty comes in. But you don't see much sovereignty discourse in the US media, because I think, they like it when things explode on the TV as their viewership goes up, and their consolidated relationships with defense contractors are more profitable. So they want to say, oh, well, other countries, they're not legitimate. We can just do whatever we want to them because we're the good guys and they aren't. So.
But we have a problem here. We've got, it's just like the rest of the world, it is the politicians that control what might or might not happen with diplomacy. And the politicians use the dog whistles on all kinds of subjects and get voted in and out on peripheral things. And it affects the rest of our lives. It's like right now the world is blowing up because kids might have to go back to online classes, and the moms will vote the Democrats out because of that. That's what the paper is saying this morning. It's crazy.
Yeah.
That may happen.
But it's a reality.
Yeah, well, the reality of us is that I think a lot of foreign countries, as Bert was really right to point out, a lot of foreign countries have learned, oh, we really turn on a dime sometimes. We are not always the most long-term reliable actor, and that is a problem. And that's built into our domestic politics, and it has its advantages. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes you vote the bums out and you vote the bums out, but because it leaks into our grand strategy in foreign policy, it's very, very difficult for people to be like, oh, it's the United States. Well, they're always good to their word. Though we can totally predict what they'll do in 4 to 8 years, and it's like, well, no, you can't. It's very hard. And then sometimes we do have a consensus, but it's not always so great, as the Middle East also has found out over the past few decades. So this is a difficult issue, but this is why I think that if we take a more background approach, we probably could avoid overly politicizing a lot of this domestically, which means that a new administration or what have you, a new branch of Tom Cotton types would be less likely to notice or change something because they wouldn't even know. I mean, a lot of these people are very low information, right? So if something isn't right at the front of everything, it's much harder for them to meddle with. But that's an unknown for me. I'm just throwing that out there as an idea. But oh, I see we have a question from my friend, actually going back to high school. Natalie Mercandetti has sent a text question which says, hey, everyone, and Chris, I'm wondering if you would elaborate on your point about the US needing to stop identifying so strongly with Saudi Arabia. Which Saudi policies and objectives are harmful to MidEast peace? What should our government's relationship with Saudi Arabia look like ideally? What up? That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that, because Saudi Arabia is truly one of the most malignant actors on the world stage, and it has also been a diehard U.S. ally since World War II. And you can always get people in DC to admit that Saudi Arabia is a terrible, awful, annoying theocracy that sends its radical missionaries throughout the region and even to the U.S. prison system, converting people to Wahhabi Islam, and generally has very weird relationships between its intelligence services and various terrorist organizations. It's also the birthplace of Wahhabism, which is the most obnoxious form of Islam that came about in the 18th century and is a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, and that it was like not strict enough. And yeah, so we have a relationship with Saudi Arabia because of the oil. Obviously, they have, or at least they had for the longest time, the most oil of any country within its territory. Interestingly enough, this is worth keeping in mind, the overwhelming majority of Saudi oil is located in a Shia part of the country in the east that really does not like the central government. So this creates a weird internal unstable dynamic of it would be like if all of Britain's resources were located in Northern Ireland, kind of. So there's this like very weird domestic problem that exists. So they always had to be a security state once they became the oil exporter du jour. The problem, of course, with the assumption is that we need Saudi Arabia because of the oil, because of its central location, because it's better to have them on our side than to have them against us, since they have so many sketchy connections. This is no longer true because the US is now a net oil and gas exporter, and the US is, of course, allies and neighbors to Canada, which is an even bigger portion of the population net oil and gas exporter. Now, I'm very environmentalist, so I'm not saying like woohoo fracking hooray, but the fact of the matter is fracking has absolutely helped break us of our dependency on Middle Eastern oil. So that's the one and only, as far as I'm concerned, good thing about it. And therefore, Saudi Arabia's position towards us is much weaker than it used to be now. To specifically address Natalie's question, why does it have harmful policies? It increases radicalism everywhere. And also the guy who's most likely to inherit the throne, Mohammed bin Salman, is incredibly erratic and is probably going to end up like some weird combination of like Erdogan and like the original Ayatollah Khomeini. He's a true whack job, and he's even more erratic than we are in the region. And he wants Saudi Arabia to be as powerful a country as something like Turkey and Iran. Of course, without Egypt, that probably won't happen, but that is his attempt, and that's why Saudi Arabia and Egypt try to suck up to each other all the time. It's their gateway to great power status. They see it that way. Why we shouldn't be involved is because, yeah, they harm our interests through their support of radical groups. They also are no longer as useful as they used to be. But I'm not saying that we should then just say, oh, we hate you so much that we won't talk to you anymore. I just think that we should just be very neutral towards them, neither positive nor negative, just kind of more divorced from it. Because the closer we are to Saudi Arabia, the more likely, as our people on the ground, them and some other countries, we are to get sucked into their conflicts. And I think Yemen is the best example of this. Like Yemen is a totally Saudi Arabia conflict, and it's become a very American conflict because we supply, us in the United Kingdom, supply most of the bombs that Saudi Arabia drops on Yemen. We also facilitate their kind of economic blockade of the country. It's turned it into probably the largest humanitarian disaster of the 21st century, and it's been going on at this point for a very, very long time. We have played a stronger role in the war before than we do now, but we still are involved in this. And this is not helping regional stability, to say anything. This isn't helping anyone except Saudi Arabia not have to admit they've kind of lost. The Houthi rebels, who have very little of anything, Iran technically supports them, but I doubt they get very much through the maritime blockade of Yemen. So there's probably some things, but not very much. So the small band of like hill people has effectively embarrassed Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and company, and its various mercenaries. because fun fact, a lot of these Arab states, the citizens are so affluent and they partake in conspicuous consumption that a disproportionate percentage of the population is like really obese, and so they tend not to use their military in direct deployments, and they tend to hire mercenaries and get like random other people from different countries to do work for them. And they do have money, so they just throw money at these various people. And despite all this money and all this effort, the Houthis keep, I mean, they're not like winning per se, but they keep embarrassing Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia can't admit that it's its first big foreign intervention, even if it's right across the border, because they've kind of lost. And so they just keep going, they double down, and they get America to back them up, resupply them with weapons, resupply them with whatever. And America is always talked into it because Saudi Arabia says, oh, Iran backs the Houthis, so we have to fight them. And America says, ooh, Iran, okay, we have to fight them, and throws all this stuff at them. And it's that kind of relationship where DC is too willing to take Saudi Arabia at its word, too willing to believe what it says, and too willing to support it. And I would say alliances are, you know, they're not meant to be permanent. They're meant to suit specific things at specific times. I mean, everyone knows this when we look at World War II. The US and the USSR were allies in World War II, big allies. We sent them tons of weapons. Then we weren't allies after World War II because we were the two biggest threats to each other's autonomy of action on the world stage. And we were competing over who, you know, would have more influence in the decolonizing world as the old empires fell apart. So, you know, alliances aren't meant to be permanent. We had an alliance with Saudi Arabia in the context of World War II and the Cold War. We don't need it now. I really struggle to think of what we get out of this anymore. And I can name so many reasons of things that we get that are bad from it right now. So I would just say it's part of, I think a peace plan would be, as we take a step back, we take a more neutral view towards facilitating different power blocks negotiating with each other. And that includes taking a more neutral view towards Saudi Arabia, just as much as it does to the other countries in the region.
We have a few minutes left. I wanted to shift the conversation maybe a little bit about the internal conflicts within Israel. I mean, here we have, you know, members of a synagogue, and people really have this kinship, you know, relatives, you know, history and so on. And we have conflicts between American Jews who are very concerned about the treatment of Israelis, of Palestinians. And then we have the reality in Israel itself, who's concerned about any threats to their survival. And this is creating what seems to me an increasing block in American politics that, you know, look to defund, look to, you know, boycott, all this other crazy stuff. And any comment or recommendations about, you know, finding peace within that community itself? I mean, they seem to be at odds with different principles.
Well, now you're really going out of my realm of knowledge. I don't know how helpful I can be on this.
Okay, fair enough.
I can only say that you, in this divide, you do see a certain amount of like kind of people that tilt towards like, well, Israel treats Palestinians poorly, therefore it's illegitimate, versus people that say, well, Israel is like super legitimate, and how dare you even talk about Palestinians whatsoever. And I think that the tendency to break into these kind of totally bifurcated camps is not helpful. Like, my own personal opinion is like any state that exists and can uphold its existence has the right to exist, which Israel obviously did starting in 1948 and continues to do so. And my opinion is also that you can say, well, that's therefore a legitimate state. And at the same time, also say, I can criticize the policies of a legitimate state. I mean, whether it's my country or another. I think somewhere in between those two poles is to be found actual dialogue. Like, it's just not helpful to tilt towards a Manichaean binary. That's all I can really say on that.
I want to ask for those who are here, are there any questions that are lingering that maybe you're hesitating to ask? And we have a few more minutes, and, you know, even if it's not fully thought out, please ask. You're here because it concerns you. Do I say, Maurice, if you had to unmute?
Oh, yes.
Here.
If you want to unmute, either hit the mic button or hold down space bar while you talk, and it should unmute you while you keep the space bar down.
No, you're still,
Hmm.
I,
Okay, well, hunt for at the bottom left of the screen, there should be a mic button that's probably red with a line through it. You want to click that so it unmutes. See if that works.
well, I see a mouth moving, but I hear no sound. Okay. Or I could type it into the chat.
You can type it into the chat. If you go to the chat button at the bottom of the screen and you click on that, you should get access to the chat sidebar and you can type what you want to in it.
You know, I don't think it's going to work.
Or
We're
typing
trying.
is happening, I'm not sure.
Okay. So I guess we can wrap it up by
Wow.
a summary of some sort. We're here because we have hope.
Unmute.
Yeah. Well,
Now-
I would, oh,
A
sorry,
quick-
I would just say that I can't promise any kind of magic bullet for Middle East peace, but I do think there'll be more peace if sovereign states can behave like sovereign states and deal with each other as a functional equals when they're dealing in diplomacy that transcends sectarianism and ideology.
Okay. No, I think I see the $1 Morris Buttercell. You're unmuted now. So if you have something that you wanted to say.
All right, my quick question, am I being heard?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
hear you now.
Chris, is it feasible for Russia and the United States to come to terms that are acceptable? I know what all the input from all the individual countries and powers, but is it feasible for the United States and Russia to make an acceptable proposal that includes almost everybody? It's pretty wide paintbrush I'm using, but is it feasible to come to some point of agreement and work bit by bit to bring everybody into the game?
Let's try to do that now.
Bringing everyone into the game might be really hard.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
if you,
I understand
because there's
that,
so
and
many different interests and whatever, but if you mean, but specifically if it's like, can the US and Russia get along better than they do now? I do in fact believe that's possible. And I do think it's precisely because China is getting more and more powerful that it will happen eventually. Because, you know, unlike us, Russia has a pretty big border with China, and they don't like playing junior. It's an inverse of the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s when China was the weaker partner to the Soviet Union, and they didn't like being number two all the time and have Moscow dictate what they did. So they rebelled and they kind of split off and actually, if anything, worked more with the US against the USSR than vice versa. It wouldn't surprise me if something like that eventually happens with Russia in China's old position, rebelling against the stronger power, wanting to take a more independent tack. But China knows that this could happen too, so it tends to treat Russia much lightlier than Moscow used to treat Beijing. So they're a bit smarter about it. But it's not going to happen as long as there's all these weird little proxy conflicts between NATO and Russia. And so what needs to happen right now, I think the number one concern is the Ukraine and what's going to happen with the Ukraine, which is a very big, I don't know what's going to happen with the Ukraine. One has to be prepared for any eventuality, of course, but I think it's, well, we'll see, but I do think it is possible to diplomatically resolve the Ukraine crisis. Will that happen? I don't know, and I couldn't give you odds on it, but I do think it's possible to diplomatically resolve simply because Russia has been under a lot of pressure, and China wasn't even a big fan of the annexation of Crimea, but Russia does control Crimea. It's more its deployments in eastern mainland Ukraine and the Donbas region that are the problem. And I think eventually it wouldn't surprise me if you get, assuming you don't see like Russia, if Russia attacks the Ukraine, I'm just going to say this, it would be very stupid. And so it's not very likely if they went all the way to Kiev or they tried to take over the whole country. I don't think that's in the cards. I think what they're going to do if they attack Ukraine, which once again, this could all be a front for the sake of strengthening their hand. It might not happen. But if they do attack the Ukraine, I think they're going to go to the Dniester River and not a step west of it. I think they're only going to seek to control the areas that are predominantly ethnic Russian, where people won't resist them, where people might even like them. The regular non-Russian Ukrainians would resist them to the death, so they wouldn't want to be bogged down in that. They just want enough of a slice of land to connect the Donbass to the Crimea and to have the predominantly Russian populated areas under their control. I wouldn't imagine it would go further than that because they would lose. It would not be good for them if they kept going. That if this happens at all. But I do think that it might be possible, diplomatically speaking, to get the Russians out of the Donbass diplomatically by recognizing their control of Crimea, which is 99% ethnically Russian anyway. It has been for since Catherine the Great replaced the Tatar Khanate in the 18th century, literally right the same decade that the United States was born. You know, I think Russia does control the Crimea, barring a collapse of the Russian state. And so there eventually might be a diplomatic solution that says, you get out of the Donbass and we'll recognize that you control Crimea. And if this were to happen, it would probably increase the odds that Russia and the United States could have a more normal diplomatic relationship. But you know, right now in the immediate future, I just don't see a grand US-Russian bargain because both sides have played up their hatred of each other so much for a domestic audience that neither would be like, you'd be a very unpopular politician if you were like, oh, let's get together, let's 1991 it all, you know, let's Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country. It's just like in the future that might happen, absolutely, but in the near future, probably not.
Well, I thank you so much. I think we're just about out of time. This has been a wonderful excursion for me, and I hope for everybody else, into understanding, you know, the complexities and the professionalism of diplomacy. And I
Thank you for having me.
Thank you,
Our
Chris.
Thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you, Chris.
It was my pleasure, and I'll see
Thank
you
you.
all later.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.